The millionaire CEO couldn't miss the chance to humiliate his poor ex-girlfriend, who now worked as a waitress at his party. He pointed at the harp on stage and shouted, "I dumped you and became CEO, and you became a waitress. The closest you got to your dream was that." He was laughing when the real host of the party, a reclusive billionaire, took the microphone and stopped the music. A deadly silence filled the room. The billionaire called the waitress to the stage, put his arm around her, and looking into the CEO's eyes announced, "The grand ballroom of New York's St. Regis Hotel glittered with an almost celestial intensity. It was the most exclusive charity event of the year, a spectacle of power and opulence orchestrated by the reclusive arts billionaire Arthur Sterling. Beneath the vaulted ornate ceiling, colossal crystal chandeliers poured a golden light that kissed the polished marble floor, reflecting the parade of jewels and silks of Manhattan's elite. Every detail, from the floral arrangements that scented the air with a mix of lilies and jasmine, to the sterling silver flatware gracing the tables, whispered of incalculable wealth. Center stage, an orchestra tuned its instruments, the hum of strings and winds, weaving a tapestry of anticipation. In the spotlight, isolated by a halo of light, a magnificent golden harp gleamed, promising a night of melodies that would touch the soul. Richard "Rick" Vance, a multi-millionaire real estate CEO, felt like the true master of this universe. Securing the invitation had been a strategic battle, a months-long campaign involving contacts, favors, and a donation that could have bought a luxury condo on Park Avenue. But it had been worth it. He was here to be seen, to solidify his position, and above all, to impress Arthur. Closing a deal with Sterling would mean not just profit, but an ascension to a new echelon of power, transforming his already vast fortune into a legacy. Every smile he distributed, every firm handshake was a calculated move in his private chess game, where the prize was always more capital, more influence, more of the world at his feet. Suddenly, while calculating the ROI on his latest investment, his gaze was caught by a figure moving with silent efficiency near the service area, a figure that looked painfully familiar, a ghost from a past he had worked so hard to bury beneath layers of success and money. Dressed in the stark, functional black and white uniform of a waitress, carrying a silver tray of bubbling champagne flutes, was Elena. The air seemed to thicken, heavy and oppressive. For a moment, shock paralyzed him, but the surprise quickly curdled into a perverse pleasure, a cruel delight that spread through his chest. It was her, his ex-girlfriend, the stubborn dreamer he had abandoned a decade ago for being, in his cutting words, too poor and full of useless artistic dreams. A victorious, smug smile took over Rick's face. This was perfect, a cosmic validation of all his choices. Fate was offering him, on that silver platter, irrefutable proof that he had been right all along. He approached her, his expensive Italian loafers making almost no sound on the floor. His voice, deliberately loud, projected so the circle of magnates nearby could witness his triumph. "Elena, my God, is that you? How the mighty have fallen." He laughed, a dry, arrogant sound, as he took a glass from the tray she balanced with a grace that irritated him. "I left you and built a 9-figure portfolio on Wall Street. My assets have multiplied exponentially. And you're waiting tables. Looks like I made the right call, wouldn't you say?" Elena looked at him, and her reaction was the most maddening thing that could have happened. She remained calm. Her face, though a little more mature, still possessed the same serenity he once found charming and, later, infuriating. There was no shame, no humiliation, none of the pain he had expected to savor in her eyes, just an unshakable composure. Frustrated, he gestured with his glass toward the stage, the golden liquid trembling with the force of his emotion. "See that harp, Elena? You used to dream of playing one of those. You dreamed of music, and I dreamed of power, of deals, of the freedom only a great fortune can buy." He leaned in, as if sharing a profound secret, but his voice was still a theatrical whisper for the audience watching them. "The difference, sweetheart, is that I got it. My investments gave me the world, and you're here to serve me. Life is fair after all." She didn't flinch. Her brown eyes, deep as night, stayed locked on his. An enigmatic, almost amused smile played at the corners of her lips. "Excuse me, Rick. I have to get back to work." The response disarmed him. Her lack of submission was a greater insult than any word. At that exact moment, a sudden absolute silence fell over the ballroom. Conversations died, heads turned to the stage. The host, the legendary Arthur Sterling, ascended the steps and took the microphone. The music stopped. The air grew thick with expectation. "Good evening, everyone," Arthur said, his voice calm, yet carrying an authority that seemed to make the very air vibrate. "Tonight, we celebrate not only philanthropy, but the rebirth of our city's Philharmonic Orchestra. And to mark this new era, I want to introduce the brilliant woman who will be the new creative force behind it." Arthur paused, his eyes scanning the rapt crowd. Rick felt a chill run down his spine. A dark premonition. The billionaire looked directly at him, standing there arrogantly beside Elena. A small smile formed on Arthur's face as he spoke, his next words echoing through the silent hall with the precision of a guided missile. "Mr. Vance, I see you've already met our guest of honor. Thank you for keeping her entertained." Arthur Sterling's next words, "my fiancé," echoed through the ballroom like the toll of a cathedral bell, reverberating in the stunned silence of Manhattan's elite. Rick's face froze into a mask of pale horror. The smug smile that had adorned his lips moments before dissolved as if it had never existed. The champagne flute, which he held like a scepter of his power, slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered on the marble floor. The sharp, cutting sound was the only noise to break the spell, a perfect echo of his own world breaking into 1,000 pieces. He looked from Arthur to Eleanor and then back to Arthur, his mind reeling in a vortex of denial and panic. Guest of honor, fiancé, the waitress, the useless dreamer. It was a nightmare, a cosmic joke of atrocious taste. The circle of guests who had been watching his humiliation of Elena with poorly disguised delight now stared at him with a new expression, a mixture of shock, contempt, and a certain sadistic pleasure. He was the evening's main attraction, but for all the wrong reasons. The hunter had become the prey, and the concrete and luxury jungle was ready to devour him. On stage, Arthur continued, his calm only amplifying Rick's internal chaos. "I met Elena almost 2 years ago," he began, his voice pulling everyone's attention back to him, to the story he was now weaving. "She was playing an old harp in a small club in Greenwich Village for a handful of tourists and bohemians. But what I heard wasn't background music. It was the soul of an artist fighting to be heard, a voice that refused to be silenced by the world's indifference." He looked at Elena with an admiration so palpable it seemed to warm the air around her. "I discovered she was a brilliant composer with a portfolio of work that left me speechless. Work she created amidst hardships most of us here can barely imagine. She fought. She worked jobs far beneath her talent, just to keep her dream alive." Every word from Arthur was a nail being hammered into the coffin of Rick's reputation. He was painting a portrait of a heroine, a woman of unshakable strength and talent, and in doing so, he was painting Rick as the petty villain who had tried to crush her spirit. Arthur gestured for Eleanor, who stepped forward, approaching the microphone. A powerful calm enveloped her. The nervousness she had felt earlier had dissipated, replaced by a clarity of purpose. She looked out at the crowd, at the curious and shocked faces, and her gaze passed over Rick, not lingering, but long enough for him to know he had been seen. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear and melodious. filling the hall. It's an honor to be here. Music, for me, has always been more than just notes on a page. It's the language of resilience, the soundtrack of hope. She didn't mention him. She didn't have to. Her story was the most eloquent refutation of everything he stood for. Often, the world tries to tell us what we should be, tries to put a price on our dreams, and label as useless the passions that don't generate an immediate profit. I've learned that the greatest investment we can ever make is in ourselves, in our truth, even when no one else seems to believe in it. Her words, though gentle, were incisive. Rick felt them like physical blows. He watched, helpless, as the woman he had dismissed as a liability in his life was revealed to be the most valuable asset of the night, the future wife of a billionaire. He began to feel the floor disappear from under his feet, the realization dawning that social humiliation was just the first wave of a tsunami about to sweep away his life. As Elena's voice filled the hall with unshakable dignity, her mind traveled back to a particularly dark point, a decade earlier, days after Rick had left her. The memory was as sharp as a shard of glass. She was sitting on the floor of her tiny walk-up apartment in the East Village, the eviction notice on her makeshift coffee table, the sound of Rick's laughter still echoing in her ears. "Useless dreams," he had said. The words seared into her memory. "Music doesn't pay the bills, Eleanor. Wake up and smell the coffee." That night, she had looked at her cheap harp, bought with months of savings from countless part-time jobs, and felt an overwhelming urge to give up, to sell the instrument, get a realistic office job, and accept that he was right, that she was just a foolish dreamer. The pain of the romantic rejection was an open wound, but the pain of almost abandoning herself, of betraying the essence of who she was even deeper. It was then, in an act of pure defiance against his voice in her head, that she sat down and began to compose. The melody that emerged from her fingers was the saddest and, at the same time, the most hopeful she had ever created. It was her small act of rebellion, a spark of light in the darkness, the decision to keep believing in her own worth even when the man she loved told her she had none. She remembered the decade that followed as a long, arduous climb. She worked as a waitress, a receptionist, a retail clerk. Every dollar earned was split between rent and the upkeep of her dream. There were nights she had only ramen and tap water for dinner so she could afford new strings for the harp. There were moments of despair, of loneliness, when Rick's cynical voice would return to haunt her, but the music was her anchor, her refuge. And then, nearly 2 years ago, on a rainy night in that small Greenwich Village club, Arthur Sterling had walked in. He sat in a dark corner, a distinguished but discreet-looking man. He stayed for hours, listening to her play, his gaze intense and appreciative. At the end of the night, he approached her and didn't talk about business or money. He talked about the soul in her music. It was the first time in years someone had seen past the waitress and recognized the artist. Their connection wasn't instantaneous, but gradual, built on long conversations about art, life, and resilience. He didn't see her as a charity project, but as an equal, a force of nature that just needed the right environment to flourish. He didn't save her. He invested in her, giving her the tools so she could save herself, and by extension, the dream of an entire orchestra. Back in the present, on the stage of the St. Regis, she finished her brief speech. The applause that followed was warm and genuine. She looked out at the audience and her gaze met Rick's. He was pale, broken. For a moment, she expected to feel a flicker of triumph, a taste of revenge, but she felt none of it. What she saw was a diminished man, a ghost of his own arrogance. The man who had hurt her so deeply now seemed small, pathetic, and what she felt was not hatred, but an overwhelming wave of a complex and liberating emotion, a mixture of pity and indifference. He no longer had any power over her. His words could no longer wound her. His validation or contempt was irrelevant. She had healed from the wound he had left, and the scar had become a source of strength. In that instant, she knew she was truly free. Their story had finally reached its end, and the final punctuation was not revenge, but transcendence. She turned to Arthur, who offered her his hand, and together they watched the dawn of a new era, leaving Rick behind, a forgotten relic in the past. The rest of the evening passed in a feverish blur for Rick. The applause for Eleanor finally subsided, but the atmosphere in the ballroom had irrevocably changed. He was a pariah, the epicenter of a vortex of sidelong glances and poorly disguised whispers that followed him wherever he went. The same people who had greeted him with obsequious smiles upon his arrival now avoided him as if he carried a plague. He tried to approach a potential investor, a man whose capital could leverage his next major real estate project. "Mr. Davenport," Rick began, forcing a smile that felt like a grimace. The man looked at him with glacial coldness, his eyes passing through Rick as if he were transparent. "Vance, I don't believe we have anything to discuss tonight or any other night," he said, before turning his back and walking away, leaving Rick stranded in the middle of the ballroom. The message was clear. In their world, reputation was an asset as valuable as any stock on the NYSE, and his had just gone bankrupt, its value plummeting to zero. He felt cornered, the gilded walls of the ballroom closing in on him like a luxurious tomb. Every laugh, every toast seemed like a mockery directed at him. He had to get out to escape the suffocating atmosphere, the scene of his public disaster. He turned towards the exit, his only intention to reach the night outside and disappear into the city's anonymity. But his path was blocked. Standing before him, with the same imperturbable calm he had displayed on stage, was Arthur Sterling. The billionaire held 2 crystal flutes, offering one to Rick. "I believe we're owed a conversation, Mr. Vance." Arthur's voice was soft, almost friendly, but his eyes told a different story. They were cold, calculating, and held a depth that sent a shiver down Rick's spine. He realized with a terrifying certainty that the public humiliation had only been the opening act. Arthur was not a man who left loose ends. Reluctantly, he accepted the glass. "I don't just support artists, Mr. Vance," Arthur began, guiding him to an isolated terrace overlooking Fifth Avenue. "I protect them. And I also make a point of ensuring that men like you face the consequences of their actions." Rick tried to stammer an excuse, but Arthur cut him off. "This isn't just about Elena. When I decided to invest in her, I did what I always do with any major investment, a complete due diligence, and your name came up, not just as a cruel ex-boyfriend, but in other contexts, in my business dealings." Rick felt his blood run cold. It turns out your fortune was built on some very unstable and legally questionable foundations. Investment funds with dubious origins, hostile takeover tactics that border on extortion. You've been very careless." Arthur took a sip of his drink. "I am a patient man, and I have nearly unlimited resources. Consider tonight a warning. The capital you prize so much can be remarkably volatile." He finished his drink and turned to leave, but stopped and looked at Rick one last time. "By the way, check your stock prices tomorrow morning. I think you'll be in for a surprise." Arthur was gone, leaving Rick alone in the darkness, the sound of city traffic seeming to mock him, the smell of exhaust suddenly sickening. Fear, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, wrapped around him like a shroud. The war was no longer social, it was financial, and he knew he was terrifyingly outgunned. Far from the chaos descending upon Rick's life, Elena and Arthur found refuge in the serenity of his vast library, a sanctuary of knowledge and art occupying 2 floors of his penthouse overlooking Central Park. The scent of old books and polished wood filled the air, a balm to the soul after the evening's tension. Elena, dressed in a simple linen dress, ran her fingers along the spine of a volume of rare sheet music. "You didn't have to do all that," she said softly, looking at Arthur's calm face as he watched her from a leather armchair. The orchestra, the directorship, it was already more than I ever dreamed. His public humiliation wasn't necessary. Arthur stood and came to her, taking her hand. I didn't do anything, Elena. I merely provided the resources for the world to see what I saw in you. The talent, the strength, it was all there. It was just waiting for the right opportunity to blossom. As for Rick, he was the architect of his own humiliation. I just turned on the stage lights. The connection between them was palpable, a quiet harmony built on mutual admiration and profound respect. It wasn't a sweeping, youthful passion, but something deeper, more stable, the union of two souls who had found a shared purpose. But there's more to this story, isn't there? She asked, her perceptive eyes reading something beyond his calm surface. Arthur sighed, a rare sound of vulnerability. He led her to the window, which offered a breathtaking view of the sleeping city. My late wife, Liana, was a cellist, he said, his voice lowering. She was brilliant, more talented than I'll ever be at anything. But her career was cut short by an illness that took her far too soon. She always dreamed of leading an orchestra that was accessible to everyone, that took music where it was needed most, to schools, to public squares. He turned to Elena, and in his eyes she saw the depth of his pain and his love. This project isn't just for you, Elena. It's for her, too. It's the continuation of her dream. When I saw you, your resilience, your passion against all odds, I saw the same spirit that was in Liana. In that moment, Elena understood the depth of Arthur's commitment. It wasn't just philanthropy or a billionaire's whim. It was an act of love and memory. A new sense of purpose filled her. This was bigger than her own story, bigger than any settling of scores with Rick. It was about building a legacy, about honoring the past and creating a more beautiful future through art. And about Rick. She hesitated. The threat to his business. Arthur was silent for a moment. That also has to do with the past, he said, his tone hardening slightly. 8 years ago, a man named Owen Nash was my first mentor. He gave me my first shot, believed in me when no one else would. He had a small tech company, Innovatech. Rick, in his ruthless ascent, destroyed it with a hostile takeover, took everything from Owen. He never recovered. Elena finally understood. The universe, sometimes, doesn't balance the books on its own. Sometimes it needs an instrument. And Arthur Sterling was an instrument of surgical precision. She was no longer the victim in Rick's story. She was the architect of her own destiny, and she was ready to build something magnificent and enduring. The next morning's sun rose pale and sickly for Rick. He had barely slept. Arthur's words echoing in his mind like a sinister mantra. The first thing he did, before even coffee, was to switch on his Bloomberg terminal. His heart plummeted. Shares of Vance Holdings, his development firm, the pillar of his empire, had opened down 15%. It was a bloodbath. Panic set in. He spent the morning on the phone, screaming at his brokers, trying to understand what was happening. The answer was always the same. A massive, coordinated sell-off originating from several offshore investment funds. It wasn't market panic. It was a deliberate attack. An invisible, powerful force was liquidating his stock, driving down his company's value on purpose. Arthur's threat hadn't been a bluff. He was being hunted. In the days that followed, the nightmare deepened. News of what had happened at the gala spread through Wall Street like wildfire, adding fuel to the crisis. The story of the public humiliation alone would have been devastating, but the rumor that he had incurred the wrath of Arthur Sterling was what truly terrified everyone. Arthur's name was synonymous with nearly infinite capital. A war against him was corporate suicide. His business allies, men with whom he'd closed million-dollar deals, suddenly weren't returning his calls. His lawyers, once aggressive and confident, now spoke of damage control and settlements. He was toxic. No one wanted to be caught in the shockwave of the explosion that was his life. Alone in his luxury penthouse, overlooking the city he believed he had conquered, Rick felt for the first time the true nature of power. It wasn't just having money. It was the ability to make the world bend to your will. And he had lost that ability. Paranoia set in. He saw conspiracies everywhere. Every unanswered email, every cancelled call was further proof of Arthur's network closing in around him. He tried to fight back, to use his usual tactics of intimidation and pressure, but it was like punching water. His threats were met with silence or, worse, condescending laughter. His power, which he thought was intrinsic to him, was revealed to be entirely dependent on his wealth and reputation, and both were disintegrating. The net worth he had spent a decade building tooth and nail was evaporating in a matter of days. One afternoon, as he stared at his company's balance sheet, watching the red numbers spread like a hemorrhage, he remembered a conversation with Elena years ago. She had told him that he didn't love money, but the power it gave him over others. At the time, he had laughed. Now, the truth of those words haunted him. He had built an empire of sand, and the tide, in the form of Arthur Sterling, was coming in. The final blow of that week arrived in the form of a thick, letter-headed envelope delivered by a process server. It was a formal notification, a full investigation into his business practices over the last 10 years. The sender was the most feared law firm in the country, representing their new client, Arthur Sterling. The legal notice was an intimidating document, a volume of over 200 pages that detailed, with surgical precision, every questionable transaction, every hostile takeover, every unethical maneuver Rick had perpetrated in his career. It was as if someone had opened his secret ledger and exposed every corporate sin for the world to see. The unstable foundations Arthur had mentioned were, in fact, a labyrinth of exploited legal loopholes and pressure tactics that, if not strictly illegal, were morally bankrupt. Rick had always prided himself on his aggression, on his ability to win at all costs. Now, every one of his victories was being re-examined under the relentless microscope of the country's best lawyers. Desperate, he did what his instinct always told him to do. He attacked. He managed, through a contact who still owed him a favor, to get the address of Arthur Sterling's private office. He stormed the place unannounced, brushing past the stunned receptionist. He found Arthur in a minimalist meeting room with glass walls overlooking a Zen garden. The billionaire did not seem surprised. He calmly gestured to a chair. "I was expecting you, Vance." "What do you want?" Rick spat the words, throwing the notice onto the mahogany table. "This is a declaration of war. You're going to bankrupt me over some bitter ex-girlfriend." Arthur stared at him, his face a mask of serenity that only enraged Rick further. "I've already told you, Elena was the catalyst, not the cause. Though what you did to her is an excellent summary of your character." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden. "Do you remember Innovatech, Rick? 8 years ago, a small software company. You bought it, or rather, you crushed it, sliced it up, sold the patents, and fired every employee. It was one of your first big scores." Rick frowned. The name was vaguely familiar, a footnote in his meteoric rise. So what? Business is business. The founder of that company was Owen Nash, Arthur said, turning to face him, and now there was a layer of ice in his voice. "Owen was my first mentor. He gave me a job when I was nobody. He taught me about business, but also about integrity, about building something of value, not just accumulating wealth. You destroyed him, took everything from him. The company was his life's work. He died 2 years later of a heart attack. The doctors said it was the stress, Suddenly, it all clicked into place in Rick's mind with a terrible, blinding clarity. This was the turning point, the moment the curtain pulled back to reveal the true mechanics of his disaster, the social humiliation, the financial attack, the legal investigation. None of it was random. You planned all of this, Rick stammered, shock replacing anger. From the very beginning, Arthur gave a joyless smile. As I said, I'm a patient man. I waited years for the right opportunity to balance the books. Elena's talent and your arrogance just gave me the perfect stage. Rick's world spun. He wasn't the victim of a cruel fate. He was the target of a meticulous, cold, and long-planned revenge. The realization hit him with the force of a gut punch. He had already lost. The battle was over before he even knew he was in one. The revelation in Arthur's office left Rick in a daze. He returned to his penthouse, but the luxury around him felt hollow, a mockery. He was in freefall, and now he knew there was no parachute. The legal battle was a massacre. Arthur's team unearthed skeletons Rick didn't even remember burying. Each day brought a new motion, a new subpoena, a new exorbitant bill from his own lawyers, who sounded increasingly pessimistic. To fund his defense, he had to start liquidating his assets. The first to go was the art collection. Pieces he had bought as trophies, symbols of his status, were sold at hasty auctions for a fraction of their value. Watching the paintings being taken off his walls was like having his own skin stripped away. Each sale was a small death, a divestment of his identity. He, who defined himself by his possessions, was becoming a man with nothing. After the art came the properties, the beach house in the Hamptons, the villa in Napa Valley. Places where he had thrown extravagant parties, where he had felt like a king, were now just line items on a balance sheet, necessary sacrifices to delay the inevitable. He found himself wandering the empty rooms of his penthouse, the spaces where sculptures and paintings once stood, now screaming with their absence. Loneliness was his only companion. His friends had vanished. The women who once surrounded him no longer answered his calls. He was isolated in his ivory tower, which now felt like a prison. One sleepless night, he poured himself an expensive whiskey, one of the few luxuries he had left, and sat on his balcony, watching the lights of New York City. He remembered the feeling of power that view used to give him. Now he felt small, insignificant. His mind took him back to the Innovatech takeover. He remembered the face of Owen Nash, an older man with kind eyes, pleading in a cold boardroom. Rick remembered feeling a contempt for that weakness. He had felt the cruel thrill of the predator. Now, for the first time, he wondered about the man behind the company, about the life he had destroyed for a few extra dollars in his cash flow. The memory, once a source of pride in his own cunning, now filled him with the bitter taste of shame. The fortune he had built was tainted, not just by questionable tactics, but by a callous inhumanity. He was losing his money. But the real bankruptcy, he was beginning to realize, was moral, and that had set in long ago. While Rick's world unraveled, Elena's blossomed in ways she had never imagined. Leading the New York Philharmonic was a monumental challenge, but she embraced it with a fierce passion. She was not just an artistic figurehead, a pretty face for Arthur's project. She dove into the management, the finances, the logistics. She spent her days in meetings with musicians, administrators, and patrons, and her nights poring over scores, composing and arranging. At first, there was skepticism. Some of the older musicians, especially the concertmaster, a man named Maestro Russo, viewed her with suspicion. To them, she was the billionaire's fiancée, an amateur who had been handed the position through luck, not merit. Elena didn't confront the resistance with authority, but with work. Instead of imposing her ideas, she listened. She spent weeks speaking individually with each musician, learning about their passions, their frustrations, their hopes for the orchestra. When she presented her first proposal for the season, She included not only her own innovative compositions, but also pieces suggested by the musicians themselves, giving them a sense of ownership over the project. During one particularly tense rehearsal of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Maestro Russo openly challenged her interpretation of a passage. Instead of taking offense, Elena lowered her baton. "Maestro," she said calmly, "you have been playing this piece for 30 years. I only 10. Show me. Show all of us how your heart hears it." Stunned, the old musician played the solo passage with a passion and depth that left everyone silent. Elena smiled. "That's it. That's the emotion I want. We will follow Maestro Russo." In that small act of humility and respect, she won over the entire orchestra. Her most passionate project, however, was Music for Dreamers, an outreach program to bring music education to children in underserved communities. Using a significant portion of Arthur's endowment, she set up hubs in public schools, offering free instrument and music theory classes. She made a point of teaching a class herself once a week. Seeing a child's eyes light up as they held a violin for the first time, hearing hesitant notes transform into melodies, was for her the greatest return on investment of all. It was proof that art was not a luxury, but a necessity, a tool for transformation. She wasn't just conducting an orchestra, she was cultivating a garden of new dreams, ensuring that other voices, like her own, would not be silenced by a lack of opportunity. Her wealth wasn't in stocks or assets, but in the beauty she was sowing in the world. Rick's fall hit its nadir. The legal pressure was unsustainable. To avoid a trial that would ruin him completely and could even lead to criminal charges, his lawyers negotiated a settlement. He would have to sell Vance Holdings, the heart of his empire, the jewel in his crown. The company was bought by a consortium of investors, secretly arranged by Arthur for a fraction of its true value. The money was almost entirely consumed by fines, restitution payments, and legal fees. The multimillionaire woke up one day to find himself a man of modest means. The final blow was the sale of his penthouse. He watched, impassive, as the designer furniture, the state-of-the-art appliances, everything was taken away. He was left with a few boxes of personal belongings. He moved into a 2-bedroom rental apartment in Astoria, Queens, a middle-class neighborhood he used to fly over in his helicopter. The transition was brutal. The silence of the apartment was deafening compared to the constant buzz of assistants and staff. For the first time in over a decade, he found himself confronting the world without the shield of his wealth. He had to learn to grocery shop, to cook, to ride the subway. It was the small indignities of normal life that humiliated him daily. Being ignored by a cab driver, waiting in a bank line, having his credit card declined for insufficient funds. The arrogance that had been his armor was gone, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. People passed him on the street without a second glance. He was anonymous, invisible, and that was more terrifying than being hated. One night, while unpacking one of his last boxes, he found a small, old photo album he hadn't seen in years. He opened it, and there they were. He and Elena, early in their relationship. A picture at a waterfall upstate, another at a noisy street fair, his face painted and her laughing. They were young. They had almost nothing. He was an ambitious intern, she a dreamy music student. But their eyes, in every photo, shone with a genuine happiness, a lightness he hadn't felt in a very, very long time. He looked at the face of the young man he had been, a man whose dreams had not yet been entirely consumed by a lust for interest rates, dividends, and profit at any cost. That man in the photo wouldn't recognize him. He didn't recognize himself. What had he gained in exchange for that happiness? An empire that had turned to dust. Holding the faded photo for the first time in years, Rick cried, not from anger or self-pity, but from a profound grief for the man he could have been. The air in Carnegie Hall vibrated with a palpable electricity. The night of the New York Philharmonic's grand reopening had arrived. The hall, beautifully restored with a generous grant from Arthur's foundation, was magnificent, its red velvet and gold leaf details gleaming under the newly installed lights. The show had been sold out for months. The cultural elite, business leaders, artists, and ordinary citizens who had won tickets through a public lottery gathered together, a testament to Elena's vision of inclusive art. Backstage, it was controlled chaos. Musicians in their formal wear tuned instruments, hurried through corridors, the adrenaline of opening night mingling with the scent of violin, rosin, and perfume. Elena stood in her dressing room, facing the mirror, but she didn't see herself. Her mind was replaying every note of the symphony that would premiere that night, a composition of her own called Rebirth. The piece was her musical autobiography, a sonic journey through darkness and struggle to hope and liberation. She felt the weight of expectation, not just her own, but Arthur's, the late Liana's, the musicians, who now trusted her, and the entire city's. There was a soft knock on the door. It was Arthur. He said nothing, just came in and placed a hand on her shoulder, their eyes meeting in the mirror. "Liana would be so proud of you," he said softly. "I am so proud of you." Elena turned and hugged him. "Thank you, Arthur, for everything, for believing in me when I barely believed in myself." Their love was not a firework, but a warm, steady hearth. It was a refuge, a partnership built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and a shared purpose. He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was a conductor's baton, simple and elegant, made of rosewood, with a small silver plate engraved with the date and the words, "For our maestra." Tears welled in Elena's eyes. It was not an expensive jewel, not a symbol of wealth, but a symbol of her journey, of her achievement. It was the recognition of who she was. "It's time," the stage manager said from the doorway. Elena took a deep breath, holding the baton that felt as if it had been made for her hand. The fear transformed into determination. She walked toward the stage, not as Rick Vance's ex-girlfriend, not as Arthur Sterling's fiancée, but as Elena Reyes, composer and conductor. The story was hers now, and she was ready to conduct it. In the shadows of the top balcony, in the nosebleed seats, a man watched the audience settle. Rick Vance looked like a ghost amidst the celebration. He was thinner, his expensive suit replaced by simple slacks and a dress shirt. He had bought the ticket with the little money he had left from a freelance consulting job. He wasn't there to confront, to apologize, or to make a scene. He was there simply to witness, to see with his own eyes the world he had scorned. When the house lights dimmed and an expectant hush fell over the theater, Eleanor walked to the podium. She wore not the stunning gown from the gala, but a sober, elegant conductor's suit. Her eyes scanned the hall, filled with confidence and passion. She didn't seem to be looking for anyone. She seemed to see everyone. She raised the rosewood baton, and Rick's world held its breath along with the 3,000 people around him. The first note of the symphony, Rebirth, filled the air. It wasn't a gentle melody. It was a dissonant, painful chord, a musical cry that spoke of struggle and despair. Rick felt a chill. The music transported him back to Elena's decade of hardship, a decade he had ignored, but which was now being presented to him in all its raw emotion. The symphony progressed, moving through melancholy, somber passages, with the harp occasionally emerging as a lone voice of hope amidst the storm of strings and percussion. It was her story, told without words. As he listened, Rick finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He saw the woman he had labeled a failure, commanding 100 musicians, uniting them into a single, glorious voice. He saw the dreamer he had ridiculed turn her dreams into a palpable reality that was touching the souls of thousands. Then the music began to shift. The dark tones gave way to brighter melodies. The harmony grew richer, more expansive. It was the sound of healing, of overcoming, of blossoming. In that moment, under the cascade of sound, the grief of his loss hit him with full force. Not the loss of the fortune, the cars, the status. That was all ash, dust. The true loss, the irreparable loss, was the woman before him. He had had the chance to be a part of that beauty, to support that genius, to share that passion. And he had traded it for numbers in a bank account, for a net worth that had proven illusory. It was the worst deal of his life. The music surged to a final crescendo, an explosion of pure triumph and joy, a celebration of the resilience of the human spirit. When the final note resonated, vibrating in the air like a contented sigh, the theater was silent for a beat before erupting into a standing ovation that seemed to shake the building's foundations. The sound of the applause was like thunder, but for the first time, Rick didn't feel accused. He just felt the deep, silent void in his own soul. It was his climax, his emotional resolution, the acceptance that the real bankruptcy wasn't in his bank account, but in his heart. As the thunderous ovation continued, with cries of brava echoing through the hall, Rick didn't wait for the encores or the speeches. He stood and slipped out quietly, blending into the anonymous crowd already heading for the exits. There was no bitterness, only a melancholic resignation and a painful clarity. He had accepted his new place in the world, a spectator on the periphery of the life he could have had. The night outside was cool, and as he walked through the streets of Midtown, he felt strangely light. The weight of his arrogance, of the need to impress, had been lifted. All that was left was himself. The following months were a quiet, slow reconstruction. The legal battle with Arthur concluded with the settlement that left him with a minimal fraction of his former empire, enough to live modestly, but not enough to return to the power game. With this remaining capital, he rented a small office space and started a consulting firm. The name was simple: New Leaf Consulting. He used his vast, hard-won experience to advise young entrepreneurs. Paradoxically, he became a proponent of sustainable growth and business ethics, warning his clients against the shortcuts and pitfalls of the unchecked ambition he knew so well. It was his form of penance, a way to turn the poison of his past into an antidote for others. The work didn't bring him wealth, but it gave him a sense of purpose that money never had. Meanwhile, Elena and Arthur celebrated not only the success of the orchestra, but the beginning of their life together. They married a few months after the premiere, not in a lavish event, but in an intimate ceremony in the garden of Arthur's home, surrounded only by the musicians of the orchestra and their closest friends. Music, of course, was the heart of the celebration. It was a day of serene joy and heartfelt promises. Together, they expanded the Music for Dreamers project, ensuring that Liana's legacy and Elena's passion would touch even more lives. One day, while reviewing the project's finances, Elena noticed an anonymous donation. It wasn't in cash, but in cryptocurrency. A modest amount of Bitcoin had been transferred to the foundation's digital wallet. Intrigued, she had a tech expert try to trace the origin, but it was impossible. The donation was completely untraceable, yet in her heart she knew. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of their finances, but it was a sign that, perhaps, somewhere in the city, a man was trying in his own way to conduct a new melody in his life. 5 years later, the afternoon sun, a warm liquid gold, poured over a vibrant courtyard in the South Bronx, a place that had once been a vacant lot, a repository for rubble and hopelessness. Now it was the beating heart of the Music for Dreamers Foundation. Laughter and a delightfully out-of-tune cacophony of musical notes mingled in the air. From one room came the hesitant sound of a violin scratching out a scale. From another, the enthusiastic beat of a bongo drum, and from an open window, the concentrated puff of a flute trying to find the right melody. Where there had once been silence or the sound of danger, there was now the soundtrack of opportunity. Elena, with a few fine expression lines that formed around her eyes whenever she smiled, was at the center of it all. She was no longer the director of the New York Philharmonic. She had proudly passed the baton to Maestro Russo, now a dear friend and her biggest admirer, to dedicate herself body and soul to the foundation. She was sitting on a small bench outdoors, next to a 10-year-old girl named Anna, whose small, hesitant fingers were trying to find the strings on a small lap harp. Frustration was plain on the girl's face. "I can't do it, Miss Elena. My fingers won't listen." Elena smiled, a smile that held the patience of one who knew that struggle intimately. "The harp doesn't respond to force, Anna. It responds to care," she said, her voice soft. "Think of your fingers as having a conversation with the strings, not giving them orders. Close your eyes. Feel the string. What do you want to say to it?" The girl closed her eyes, took a deep breath and plucked a single note, clear and pure, that hung in the air for a moment. A smile of surprise lit up her face. "I did it," Elena nodded. "You always could. You just had to listen to yourself." In that small moment resided the entire philosophy of her life and work. She wasn't just teaching music. She was teaching children to hear their own inner voices. Arthur arrived in the late afternoon, as he did most days. He was no longer just the reclusive billionaire, but a familiar figure in the community, the Mr. Arthur, who always brought cookies from the local bakery. He sat beside Elena, slipping an arm around her shoulders, and together they watched the children. "Liana would have loved this," he whispered. "She wouldn't just love it," Elena replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "She's here, in every note, in every smile." Their love had matured into a serene and powerful partnership, a cash flow of affection and shared purpose that seemed to generate infinite dividends of happiness. A few miles away, in a different universe, Rick Vance was finishing his workday. His office was a modest room in a commercial building in Midtown, with a single window that looked out onto the backs of other buildings. He had just ended a video call with a young tech startup founder, an ambitious and brilliant young man who reminded him of himself years ago. "Your growth projection is aggressive," Rick had told the young man. "But remember, the numbers on a spreadsheet are only half the story. Build a company you'd be proud of, even if you lost it all tomorrow. Profit is a consequence of the value you create, not the sole objective." The young man had looked confused, but jotted down the advice. It was the kind of advice the old Rick would have ridiculed. Now, it was the pillar of his new life. He closed his laptop and walked to the subway station. On the way, he stopped at a street cart for a bagel with cream cheese and a coffee. The same dinner he'd had the night before. The luxury of expensive restaurants was a distant memory, and he didn't miss it. On the subway, squeezed between ordinary people heading home, he was anonymous, invisible. The invisibility that would have once terrified him was now a relief. It was freedom. Arriving at his apartment in Astoria, he sat down at his old computer. He opened a crypto platform and made his monthly transfer, a small fraction of a Bitcoin, sent from an anonymous wallet to the account of the Music for Dreamers Foundation. It was not an act of guilt, not anymore. It was an act of participation. It was his only way of watering, from a distance, the garden he had once tried to trample. Afterward, he went for a walk. His destination was the usual, a bench in Brooklyn Bridge Park. He sat and watched the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple that no work of art he had ever owned could replicate. He thought of his old life, his net worth in dollars, his stocks, his assets. They were like ghosts from a fever dream. He had lost nearly all his fortune, but in the process, he had found something priceless: peace. True wealth, he had finally learned, was not a number. It was the tranquility of a clear conscience. It was the taste of simple coffee at the end of the day. It was the free beauty of a sunset. And as the last ray of sun disappeared behind the skyscrapers, Rick smiled. A genuine, tired, and, for the first time in his life, truly rich smile. He didn't have an empire, but he had himself. And that, he finally understood, was more than enough.